Welcome to the first podcast in the series here for Ms. Patel's biology class. This is Ms. Patel, and this is what you typically see at the beginning of one of my podcasts. So let me give you a little bit of breakdown of what you see, what the point of each component is, and what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about in this podcast. So at the very top in orange, you see Why Use Podcasts. That's the title of this podcast. And right below that, in this kind of a faded blue color, is the word objectives. And really, that's going to be the most important section for you when we start a podcast. Underneath this title objectives, is a list of things that you should be able to do. If you notice in brackets, just to the right of objectives, it says students will be able to. I will, in the future, abbreviate that as SWBAT, or SWABATs. Students will be able to. So these are things that you should be able to do by the end of this podcast. And I'm trying to lay it out as cleanly as possible so that you can actually use this as a check at the end of the podcast to make sure that you understand everything that you need to. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that's going to be structured to help you. So, what I recommend, and we'll talk about this in the podcast, but since this is the first one, let me just tell you up front, I would copy this down onto a clean sheet of loose leaf paper. And when I say clean, I mean one that doesn't have writing on it already. So make sure that it is free of writing, you're not using it for anything else, and that it's loose leaf paper, not paper that is already in a notebook. That's not a notebook, because you're going to need to be able to put this in your binder and possibly use it for one other thing, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So make sure you're using a clean piece of loose leaf paper. And if you don't have one right now, go ahead and pause, go find one, and come back and hit play. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and let me talk about each of these objectives so that you know what you need to be able to do. And I'm going to underline the verb in each of these, but I want you to write these down. So the first thing that we're going to talk about and that you should be able to do without your notes later is to be able to define, let me do that in a different color, define a podcast. You need to be able to tell me the definition of what a podcast is. Secondly, we're going to talk a little bit about steps to follow to find podcasts. So you need to be able to list these steps. But obviously you've found this because it's online and you know the steps to get there. But we'll just review that to make sure everyone understands how easy it is. Third, we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of podcasting. What I need you to be able to do is explain them to me. So you need to be able to know those benefits and tell me a little bit more about how they really help you as students. And lastly, you need to be able to list and describe expectations that I have of you for preparing for class. And some of those entail or are more specific to these podcasts, while others are a little more general, and we'll talk a little about them as we get moving through this podcast. So I'm going to go ahead and pause, let you write these down if you haven't done so already, but I make sure that you jot down these numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 to use as kind of an outline through the podcast, and we'll come back and refer to these. I'm going to put a little star next to number 3 because that's really probably the most. I'll put it next to 3 and 4 because these are the most important takeaways from this podcast. Whereas 1 and 2 are kind of setting you up to make sure you understand what these things are and how to find them. 3 and 4 is that all important understanding and context for using them throughout the year. So go ahead and take a moment to write these down if you have not done so already. Pause and then hit play when you're ready. Now, underneath your objectives, I'd recommend that you probably draw a horizontal line. I'm going to do my best here electronically that I can. Draw a line underneath your objectives, and then what I'd like you to do is go ahead and write number 1 so that you know that what we're about to talk about, what you're about to write down here, is relevant to the first objective, which again is to define a podcast. So I'm going to go ahead and jot down my working definition of this. You could look this up in lots and lots of places and find different definitions. But I'm going to give you what I use, what my working definition is, And essentially it's digital media that can be subscribed to and or downloaded. That's part one, or A. And the second thing that a podcast is that it comes in episodes. So while I'm not labeling this one as episode 1, because this is kind of the intro to the podcast, you will have several episodes throughout the year that kind of build upon each other and make connections for you. So that's essentially the definition of a podcast. And you need to be able to give this to me. You need to be able to give me this definition as a check for your understanding. And really, you should be able to do that without your notes. So moving on, that was a quick one. Let's go on to objective number 2. I'm going to write 2. It's a different color just to keep it a little... Actually, let me change the color on that. I'm going to give you something a little more distinct from those colors. I'm going to do this in purple. And we'll move on to the next objective, which is to find out... to list the steps of finding the podcast. So, you have found this already, so let me just cover this really quickly. There are a couple ways to do this. So, excuse me, sorry about that. So, the first way to do this is to make sure you go to YouTube, youtube.com, and then in the search, you type in Patel Honors Bio. And you use that to locate the channel, and you'll see podcasts like this. But as you know, and so you can see the podcasts that you need to watch. Especially if you go to instead of you're on the feed page is what it typically would take you to. If you click on videos, you'll see the whole list of the videos and find the one that you need. Alternatively, you could subscribe if you have your own YouTube account. But that's a conversation. If you don't have one, or even if you do, that's a conversation you need to have with your parents. Find out if you can and should have a YouTube account. So that's a maybe. And then lastly, you can follow the link on Blackboard to the videos page on my YouTube channel. And then based on what you wrote down in your your agenda or your homework book, you should know which video you need to watch, okay? So that's really how we're going to use this, and so there are a couple of options for you there of how to get to your the podcast that you need to watch. So you should be able to get to this very, very easily. Obviously you have, because you found this all right. All right, so let's go on to the next. I'm just going to scroll down here. Down to the next objective, which are the benefits of podcasting. Now, you may or may not have had a teacher that has used podcasting in the classroom. Just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits that I've seen over the years for podcasting. So, let me just point out that it keeps absent students up to date. So, if you're absent from class, you still have access to this information, and you have an understanding of what was covered, what the basic information was from the class that you missed. So, it gives you every opportunity to walk back into class the next time we see you in class better prepared and having a deeper understanding than if you were not there at all. And really, we see this. This is a bigger issue if you miss several classes in a row. But it's definitely pertinent to even missing one class. If you miss one class and don't know what was covered in that class and have not made an effort to make up the material that you missed from that class, walking into the next class is going to entail that you've missed a good deal of information. So you want to make sure that you do what you can to be updated, which may be to watch any podcast that you might miss because you missed the assignment, which means that you should check. Let's do this in a slightly different color. So you need to check Blackboard in the class logs. Jot that down in the class logs. So if you haven't seen that yet, check that out. Which means that you have watched the podcast or done any other work that you needed to come prepared. Which may mean talking to a friend as well. Anyways, that's one thing, one benefit, that it keeps students who are absent up to date. The other thing that, as another benefit of it, is as online resource, which means that it can be accessed 24/7. Anytime you need it, as long as you've got internet access or a smartphone, you can get to it because it's on YouTube. So you can stream it. You don't need to download anything as long as you can get to YouTube. It's also a content study guide, or you can use it that way, let's say that. Study guide and review. So if it's been a while since between tests, or we're coming up to a test in a unit that you're really struggling with, you can always use this to study and review material. It also is great for students, that's my abbreviation for students, who, let's say, excel with auditory and visual aids. So you need extra help, you need to see something, you need to hear me explain something, here it is. It's permanently online. And a couple other benefits are that you can pause, rewind, and rewatch as many times as you need to. So really what that means is that everyone, yes, that includes you, everyone can and probably should and must come to class prepared. Meaning that you've watched the podcast, you've taken notes, you've brought those notes to class, and that you've checked for your understanding by looking at the objectives that were listed at the beginning of class. So those are some immediate benefits to you, but I'm going to scroll down a little bit and add one other thing that that I do in my class. I'll do this in a slightly different color. That is a flipped classroom. Now that sounds a little odd, so let me explain what that is. Essentially what that means is that the idea of notes and homework are reversed. So typically what you might experience in some classes, and you may have experienced this in previous classes, is that our class time is spent with me talking to you as if you were individuals who happen to be in the same classroom with 29 other students. Well, what this allows us to do is for me to share some basic, broad information with you, outside of class by watching one of these podcasts with you engaged taking notes, writing down questions so that you can jot those questions, so that you can ask those questions at the beginning of class, and the homework that you would have been expected to do on your own, you can do in class so that I have the opportunity to correct your misunderstandings and misconceptions, and we make the most of being in a collaborative environment. With so many other students in the classroom, you can learn so much more by working together, and me serving more like a coach to you in class to help you build your understanding and deepen that content. So we can spend our class doing more labs, activities, having deep discussions, so that we can build the understandings and content knowledge that you started to build in class preparation by watching one of these podcasts. So there's a lot there that's hidden into the flipped classroom that I did not jot down. If you didn't catch it, rewind, jot it down. I want you to have some notes about what a flipped classroom is. And I also expect, because maybe this is a new idea for you, that you would have questions about how this works, what this looks like. Jot those questions down. Make sure you ask me in class, and we'll do a little bit of we'll have a little bit of discussion about that and answer any questions you have. So that's 3. I told you that's going to be where a lot of the content is. Let's talk about expectations. So I'm going to actually do that over here because I started that. So here are the expectations. So again, you come to class knowing what you missed if you were absent. And the way that you do that is by checking Blackboard and the class log on Blackboard and having watched and or prepared for class, which means that you've done any homework that you can do, that meaning you might have watched podcasts, you've prepared for class, whatever that means, that you've come as prepared as possible, and that you're not walking into class coming up to me and saying, Mr. Patel, I wasn't here last time. I know you weren't here. I know when you're absent and when you're present. It's your responsibility to access the information that you need through Blackboard. I posted up on Blackboard. I expect you to check on Blackboard. And anything that you have questions about, I'm more than happy to answer as long as you have made the first effort of trying to access that information and then coming to me with questions. So again, when you take notes, see, what your notes look like are a clean piece of loose leaf paper that you're taking notes on. At the top of it, you've got your objectives listed, written out and listed, and that you take diligent notes. So not just copying what I'm writing, I'm just kind of giving you a framework for what you need to have, but that you're writing some more information down to give you some context, so that when you read back over this, it makes more sense to you. And that, lastly, that you check your understanding. So, if you go back to the objectives that you should have written at the beginning of this podcast, make sure that you're able to do each of those things, and here's the key, without your notes. So you've taken notes, test yourself. If you can't do those, read over your notes again. Make sure that you're ready to do this without your notes, because what you should expect is what I call a podcast check, which is probably 4 or 5 questions that you're going to get at the beginning of class, and that's your homework check. That's how I'm going to assess whether or not you're prepared for class or not, evaluate whether or not you can participate in the activities or not, and if you are unable to do that, then we have a problem, in which we have a couple of plans of action that I don't need to go into detail, because we're not going to have that problem. Alternatively, from time to time, I may ask you to turn in your podcast notes and not take a podcast check. So it is very, very important that you take notes and not trick yourself into thinking, yes, I'm going to remember all of that just by watching it. So you actually do need to take some notes. By the end of the year, there's going to be a lot of notes. There's going to be a cumulative exam in which you are accountable for all of it. So this is a good time to take some extra time to jot down some notes. And that's all I have here. Jot down any questions you have. Oh, let's add that to another expectation is that you maybe that you do have questions. Maybe not every day, not every podcast. And perhaps I'm going to answer them later in the podcast. But if you do have questions, that you write them down. You're probably not the only person with that question, and you may forget the answer even if we talk about it. So at least you have a question about something that you were confused about or didn't understand, and then you can ask in class and we'll talk about it. And then there you can write the answer down in your notes for that question. And really that's going to help you out in the long run because you might have that question again, and there you go. You have the answer. There are no dumb questions. Please ask questions. I really enjoy that kind of interaction, so make sure you do have questions for me, and we'll talk about them. All right, so this is long enough. Typically, they will not be this long. Typically, what I try to do is keep them to 10 to 15 minutes, but I just wanted to go over some norms with you, so it took a little bit longer. So let's go back to our objectives, and let's see if we can do them. So I would make sure you can, sorry about this. If you can define the podcast, give yourself a check mark. If you can list the steps to find podcasts, give yourself a check mark. If you can explain the benefits of podcasts, give yourself a check mark. And lastly, if you can listen and describe expectations of you for preparing for class, go ahead and give yourself a check mark, and we're done.